October 1943, Mühlhausen, Bavaria. The British prisoners marched through the village square at dawn, work detail number 47, heading to another day of forced labor in the fields. But something unexpected happened. Children began following them, first 2, then 5, then a dozen, keeping pace alongside the column of exhausted men. An 8-year-old boy tugged at a guard's sleeve. "Bitte, Herr Feldwebel, can the Englishman teach us again today?" The guard, barely 19 himself, looked away. He'd been ordered to stop this weeks ago, but his own little brother was among the children. 10 minutes, he muttered, during the midday break. 10 minutes only. Flight Sergeant James Morrison, captured after his Lancaster was shot down over Hamburg, had been a mathematics teacher in Leeds before the war. Now, surrounded by enemy children in a German barn, he drew geometry problems in the dirt with a stick while they watched with the same intensity they'd once reserved for their fathers, now gone to the Eastern Front. These children didn't see an enemy. They saw the first teacher they'd had in 2 years. But before we continue, if you want to hear more incredible untold stories that reveal how humanity survived even in war's darkest moments, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. These are the stories they didn't put in the history books. By 1943, rural Germany was bleeding teachers. Every able-bodied man between 18 and 45 had been conscripted. The few elderly teachers left couldn't reach isolated villages. Some communities hadn't seen a teacher in 18 months. Children who'd started school in 1939 could barely read by 1943. The British prisoners arrived in German villages for agricultural work, harvesting, ploughing, repairing barns. They were officers and NCOs, prohibited from hard labor under the Geneva Convention. But the Germans ignored this for agricultural assistance. What the Germans didn't expect was what these men had been before the war. Among the prisoners, university lecturers, school teachers, engineers, clerks who taught Sunday school. Men with education the village children desperately needed. It started in Holzdorf, a village of 400 souls in Saxony. Flying Officer William Clark, a Cambridge graduate, noticed children watching him work, fascinated by his strange language. During a water break, he drew letters in English on a barn wall. The children copied them. A girl, perhaps 10, pointed at the letters and then at herself, questioning. Clark understood. He wrote her name. Anna. She gasped, delighted. Within minutes, 12 children surrounded him, all wanting their names in English letters. The German guard, a grandfather himself, watched from a distance. His own grandchildren were among the group. He'd been a school teacher before the First War, too old for the front, but young enough to guard prisoners. He saw something in Clark's patient teaching that reminded him of himself decades ago. 10 Minuten, sagte leise. 10 minutes. It became their daily allowance. Word spread through the POW work details with shocking speed. Village children were desperate to learn, and British prisoners were teaching them. Not Nazi propaganda, not military drills, actual education, mathematics, reading, even English phrases. The guards faced an impossible situation. Orders from Berlin were clear. No fraternization between prisoners and civilians, especially children. But these guards lived in these villages. Their own children were among the students. Their wives begged them to look the other way. Sergeant Major Thomas Hartley, captured at Dunkirk, had taught at a Birmingham grammar school. Assigned to farm work near Waldheim, he noticed the farmer's 3 children couldn't do basic arithmetic. Their mother, Frau Müller, was desperate. Her husband was dead at Stalingrad. Her children's futures were disappearing with each day of no school. She approached Hartley one evening, speaking broken English learned from a dictionary. "Please, you teach? My children, they must learn. After war, They need, how you say, opportunity. Hartley looked at the guard, Wehrmacht Private Klaus Fischer, himself barely literate, drafted from the same village. Fischer turned his back, studying the horizon intently. Permission granted through deliberate blindness. The lessons began in the barn after the day's work. Hartley used charcoal on wooden planks, teaching multiplication to children who'd forgotten how to add. Within weeks, they were solving problems their parents couldn't understand. One boy, Friedrich, 12 years old, had a genius for mathematics. Hartley recognized it immediately, the kind of natural ability that needed nurturing. In another world, this enemy child might have been his star pupil. The prisoner teachers faced unique challenges. No books, no paper, no legitimate authority. Everything had to be taught from memory, improvised from available materials. But these constraints produced extraordinary creativity. Flight Lieutenant Robert Davies, a Welsh science teacher, used barn equipment to demonstrate physics. Pulleys became lessons in mechanical advantage. Water pumps explained pressure. The harvest itself became biology class: seeds, growth, seasons, life cycles. The children had been taught that the British were uncultured barbarians, inferior to German intellect. But here was Davies explaining complex scientific principles with patience and enthusiasm. One girl later wrote, "He made us understand things our German teachers never could. He cared if we learned." Language became the most dangerous subject. Teaching English to German children could be seen as treason, preparing them for enemy occupation. But the children begged for it, sensing somehow that knowing this forbidden language might matter someday. Pilot Officer Michael Thompson from Oxford had taught Latin and Greek before joining the RAF. He began with careful English phrases hidden within agricultural vocabulary. "This is wheat" became a grammar lesson. "The cow gives milk" taught sentence structure. The children absorbed it eagerly, whispering English words to each other like secret passwords. The guards developed selective deafness. When inspecting officers visited, the children would quickly hide their makeshift notebooks, precious papers stolen from Nazi bureaucracy, covered with English words and British mathematics. January 1944. An SS inspection team arrived unexpectedly in Mühlhausen. They found 11-year-old Greta Hoffmann doing algebra taught by a British prisoner. Her notebook, clearly showing weeks of lessons, contained problems no German teacher had assigned. The SS officer, Hauptsturmführer Werner Krause, held the notebook like evidence of a capital crime. "Who taught you this?" Greta, terrified, pointed at Morrison. But then she did something unexpected. "He teaches better than anyone," she said defiantly. "I want to be an engineer after the war. How can I be an engineer if no one teaches me mathematics?" The local guard, Feldwebel Otto Richter, tried to minimize the situation. "The prisoners were just passing time, Herr Hauptsturmführer, keeping the children from causing trouble while we work." Krause wasn't convinced. Morrison and 2 other prisoners were removed immediately, sent to punishment camps. But something strange happened. Within a week, the children stopped coming to the fields. They stopped helping with harvests. Some fell ill. Psychosomatic, the village doctor said quietly. They missed their teachers. The village productivity dropped 30%. The mayor, a pragmatic Nazi party member, made a calculation. He wrote to regional command. "The prisoners' interaction with children improves morale and agricultural output. Request permission for limited educational activities under strict supervision." The response was surprisingly nuanced. Teaching mathematics and science was permitted. Germany needed engineers and scientists. Teaching English was forbidden. Teaching history or politics meant death. The children developed their own resistance. When Morrison was taken away, they created a network to continue learning. Older children who'd learned from him taught younger ones. They met in barns, forests. 12-year-old Hans Weber had learned enough English from Thompson to read simple sentences. He taught 5 other boys in secret, using a hidden English dictionary his grandfather had kept from the Weimar years. They practiced by translating farm equipment names, creating their own Anglo-German agricultural vocabulary. When new prisoners arrived, the children would test them, looking for teachers. They'd write mathematical problems on barn walls, leave them where prisoners would see. If a prisoner solved them correctly and showed teaching ability, the children would orchestrate ways to learn from them. One girl, Ingrid Bauer, kept a secret journal in English, taught by various prisoners over 2 years. She wrote, "Today Mr. Collins taught us about Shakespeare. He remembered whole speeches. We don't understand all words, but we understand feelings. Romeo and Juliet are like Klaus and Anna from our village, forbidden to love because families fight." The guards faced increasing pressure. Some were threatened with Eastern Front deployment if they allowed teaching to continue. Others were offered rewards for reporting it. But most had become complicit, watching their own children bloom under enemy tutelage. Private Fisher, the illiterate guard, secretly asked Hartley to teach him to read. Every evening, after ensuring no officers were near, he'd sit with Hartley for 10 minutes, slowly sounding out words. By winter 1944, he could read simple German texts. The British prisoner had given him what his own country never had: literacy. February 1945. The war was clearly ending. American artillery could be heard in the distance. The village of Waldheim faced a terrible decision. Soviet forces were approaching from the east. The prisoners might be their only protection, witnesses that might prevent atrocities. But new orders arrived. All prisoners were to be marched west immediately, away from advancing Allies. No exceptions. Frau Müller gathered the village women. "They taught our children when we had no one else. Now they'll be marched to death or shot as the Reich collapses. We have a choice," the women decided. That night they approached the guards, their own husbands, brothers, sons. "Let them escape," they said. "Look away. For what they've done for our children." Feldwebel Richter faced the hardest choice of his life. These prisoners had taught his daughter mathematics, his son English, had given his children a future beyond the Dead Reich. But letting them escape meant treason, execution if caught. He made his decision. That night he got drunk, deliberately, visibly. The other guards, understanding the message, did the same. The barn doors were accidentally left unlocked. Maps were carelessly left where prisoners could find them. Hartley woke the British prisoners at 2 a.m. "The guards are drunk. The doors are open. There are maps." Some prisoners didn't believe it. Surely a trap. But Thompson looked outside. The guards were indeed unconscious, or pretending to be. Even the dogs had been mysteriously fed enough to make them sleep. 15 British prisoners escaped that night. They left something behind. Letters for the children, written in German they'd learned during captivity. Morrison's letter to his geometry students: "Continue learning. Mathematics has no nationality. After the war, find proper teachers. Remember, education is the only thing that cannot be taken from you." Thompson left an English dictionary with a note: "For Hans and his group. You are not enemies. You are students. Never stop learning." Hartley wrote to Friedrich, the mathematical genius: "You have a gift. Don't let war or politics waste it. The world will need builders, not destroyers. Build something better than we did." The escaping prisoners made it to American lines 3 days later. They reported the village's assistance, ensuring Waldheim would be protected when Americans arrived. But the story didn't end there. The children kept learning. using the hidden notes and lessons the prisoners had left. They formed secret study groups that continued even as the Reich collapsed around them. When American forces finally entered Waldheim in April 1945, they found something extraordinary. Children who spoke English, who could do advanced mathematics, who quoted Shakespeare. The American education officer, Major James Bryant, couldn't understand it. Ingrid Bauer, now 14, explained in careful English, "British prisoners taught us. They were enemies, but became teachers. We were enemies, but became students. Learning made us human when everything else made us monsters." After Germany's surrender, investigators found evidence of the prisoner-teacher phenomenon across dozens of villages. British intelligence estimated that over 300 POWs had taught German children during agricultural work details. Thousands of children had received education from their nation's enemies. The German guards faced judgment. Some were prosecuted for allowing fraternization, but testimonies from British prisoners saved many. Hartley wrote to the occupation authorities, "Private Fisher risked his life to let us teach. He learned to read from us. He chose humanity over orders. Don't punish him for being human." The children's parents faced denazification hearings. Having allowed enemy prisoners to teach their children was seen as either collaboration or resistance, depending on the interviewer. Frau Müller told the tribunal, "My husband died for the Reich, but my children lived because of British prisoners. They taught them to think, not just obey. That's why I helped them escape." In 1946, a remarkable correspondence began. The escaped prisoners wrote to the villages, asking about the children. The children wrote back. In English, they'd continued studying. Friedrich, the mathematical genius, wrote to Hartley, "I am studying engineering at technical school. Americans are helping rebuild. I remember your lessons every day. You said build something better. I will." Hans Weber's letter to Thompson, "We still meet to read English. We have real books now. Just finished Oliver Twist. Understand now why you said education defeats tyranny." In 1955, 10 years after the war's end, a reunion was organized. British ex-POWs returned to German villages where they'd been held. Morrison walked into Mühlhausen to find a banner. "Welcome back, Herr Professor Morrison." His former students, now young adults, had prepared a geometry presentation, solving problems he'd taught them in barn dust 12 years earlier. Greta Hoffmann had become an engineer, just as she'd promised the SS officer. She embraced Morrison with tears. "You gave me my life," she said in perfect English. Thompson found Hans Weber teaching English at a gymnasium in Munich. Hans's students performed scenes from Shakespeare, the same speeches Thompson had recited from memory in hidden corners of barns. But the most moving moment came when Hartley met Private Fisher again. Fisher was now a schoolteacher himself, having learned to read and write during the war. He taught his students about the British prisoners who'd risked punishment to educate enemy children. "I tell them," Fisher said, "that learning has no uniform. Teaching has no nationality. In the darkest time, enemies became teachers and teachers became hope." A British investigation in 1960 concluded that the prisoner teachers had profoundly impacted post-war German reconstruction. Villages where POWs had taught showed higher rates of democratic participation, lower rates of extremism, and stronger economic recovery. The children they'd taught became engineers, teachers, translators, builders of the new Germany. One investigator noted, "These prisoners, through simple acts of teaching, may have done more to denazify Germany than any official program. They showed German children that their enemies were human, educated, kind. That lesson lasted longer than any propaganda." The last surviving prisoner teacher, Michael Thompson, died in 2003 at age 95. His obituary in the Times mentioned his war service briefly, but in a small German village, his death made front-page news. The headline read, "The English teacher who gave us back our future." At his memorial service in Waldheim, attended by hundreds of Germans, Friedrich Weber, now a retired engineering professor, gave the eulogy. He came as an enemy prisoner. He left as our teacher. He and others like him taught us when our own country had abandoned our education to war. They risked punishment to give us knowledge. They showed us that humanity transcends conflict. Every German child who learned from these brave men carries their lesson forward. Education survives war. Knowledge defeats hatred. And sometimes your greatest teachers come wearing enemy uniforms. Today, a small plaque stands in Mühlhausen's school. In memory of the British prisoners of war who taught our children during the darkest days. They were captives who chose to teach, enemies who chose to nurture, men who chose humanity over hatred. The children they taught are grandparents now, but they still remember the English phrases, the geometry lessons, the Shakespeare quotes taught by exhausted men in enemy uniforms who saw children in need and chose to teach. Because in the end, that's what teachers do. They teach, not because of nationality or politics or war, but because children need to learn. And learning, as Morrison wrote in that dusty barn, has no nationality. Some victories aren't won on battlefields. Some are won in barns, with sticks in the dirt, teaching enemy children that knowledge is the only true liberation. And some prisoners, even behind wire and under guard, were never truly captive, because a teacher with willing students is always free.